coronavirus. And today we're talking to someone who is an economist, and we'll try and understand what this crisis means from an economic standpoint of view, almost like an economics 101. And how do you assess it? What are the kind of issues that you should be looking at? And most importantly, can you even try and predict when it's going to change? So my guest is DK Joshi, Chief Economist of CRISIL. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Mr. Joshi. Thank you so much for joining us. So let me start off and dive in very quickly. So first question really is, how do you even assess an economic shock like this? Usually when you have a situation that is developing, whether it's a financial crisis, maybe like 2008, you could benchmark it to something else, maybe a 1929 depression or the 1987 crash and so on. How do you even begin to assess something like this?
It's extremely difficult, let me say that. And if you saw RBI's release today, they did not give the growth outlook and inflation outlook. So that tells you how difficult it is to predict. I think one of the main reasons why it is difficult to predict is we have no assessment of social distancing, how it impacts the economic activity. I think it's playing out at this scale for the first time. So that makes it, it's extremely difficult to fathom, how it will play out. So what happens in these scenarios is that you have to continuously revise your outlook as more and more information gets available. Because if you, for instance, the case of India, if I look at the data till February, actually February data shows that things have improved. So do I extrapolate that? Absolutely not. You have a big shock which has come, and the beware of the Ides of March. So March data is going to reflect some of the downside. So the point is that you have to keep assessing, keep digesting more information, assimilating it, and build it into your outlook on a continuous basis.
Right. So if we were to break that down a little bit, now there is, let's say, in a very, very elementary sense, there's demand and there's supply. Now, how do you assess what is going wrong when there is a disruption like this? I'm sure whatever you said gets disaggregated into something. So how do we pick that up and start measuring even intuitively?
Well, I think what happens is clearly what you are witnessing right now. I think there is a supply shock associated with it, but there's also a demand shock. I think both are playing out simultaneously. Supply shock could be from, the factories being shut, so you're not able to provide, or key components are not coming from China or anywhere else. So those are global supply chain disruptions, which crimp your supply. Then there's a demand element. People are losing their incomes. How much their purchasing power is going disappearing. So clearly there are both those elements, and I think what typically you would do when you assess, I think, you start with back of the envelope. Because there's no macroeconomic model which will allow you to assess this. So you look at, let's say, what part of the economy is closed, for instance. Not all services are closed. So maybe 30%, 40%, 50%, whatever that number is, that part is under a shutdown. But rest of them are still working. So I think this is how you begin to assess. And then as more information becomes available, you go micro, and then you form your judgment on the basis of some hard evidence that is coming out. I think that's how you proceed. So a macro model per se, which is typically used to forecast and assess, I don't think will work in such a scenario. So you have to go off model.
Right. So you said supply is because you talk about factories which produce goods, which could be large factories or small factories or small and medium enterprises. So tell us how this plays out on the demand side and what really happens. I know we can see people who are out of jobs on the streets, staying at home. And if you're in the manufacturing sector, obviously somewhere production has stopped. And that in turn would contribute to your ability to purchase something or not purchase something.
That's true. And I think on top of that, let's take the case of financial markets, for example, stock market. So a lot of people, you keep hearing that so much of wealth is lost. So I think that's a sentimental dampener on spending. And so you'd try to preserve cash and these things. So that the spending or demand creation actually gets a backseat. And we saw demand side factors play out very, very aggressively during the global financial crisis, which was somewhat different from this, because I think global financial crisis, for instance, had two elements which are similar to the current crisis. One was that there was deep slowdown in the economies, which is GDP growth fell. Second was massive financial sector disruption. both are playing out, but I think added to that is human misery, which I think human suffering, so to say, which we are seeing after such a long time. So it becomes, I think, GDP will not give you the true measure of pain that the system is going through. So it's a very complicated process and very difficult, and you have to. It's more of a mental model where you get inputs from. So you have to keep your eyes open to the information you are getting, but it's extremely difficult to quantify. You have to keep reassessing. So that's what I would say.
Right. So let me ask you a slightly, maybe a layman's question, right? So if everything is halted and is being halted for a month, let's say for a month there are interest rate deferments, there is an EMI deferment, there is there is income halt, but obviously there is some loss. But if everything work comes to a halt, then obviously the shock should not be that much, because exactly after a month you're resuming again, or does it not work like that?
No, I think it depends. No, I think there is also what is known as a permanent loss of GDP or productive capacity. If let's assume if this continues for let's say 3 months, some of the small businesses, SMEs, if not supported, they can just go out of the scene. So when they'll disappear. And when the economy recovers, you will lack productive capacity. And I think that's a major worry, not only in India, but elsewhere also. United Kingdom, for instance, has given a business disruption loan just to ensure that there is the permanent loss to GDP is minimized. There's going to be permanent loss, but I think you need to minimize that by ensuring that businesses just don't disappear, because it's very difficult to create the productive capacity later.
Right. So if we were to now look ahead and assess impact, so in picking up from what you said, so there is, let's say, the short-term impact and there is the medium and long-term impact. So how would we go about that?
I would say that you will have to make an assumption on how long this pandemic is going to last. For instance, we have a forecast of 3.65% for 2021. That's premised on the assumption that the virus impact will peak out during April to June quarter. So which means you would have moved towards the curve would have risen and then would have fallen by that time. So you would be improving. If that doesn't play out, let's assume, then I think you will have to build further downside, which was a downside case for you becomes a base case after some time. So if this 3.5 will have a downside if this continues beyond that. So I think that's one assumption. I think you have to keep. This is a uncharted territory. Everybody is trying to learn how to do that, and we are also trying to do the same.
Right. Yes, and you have indeed projected 3.5% as the aftermath of the pandemic. Now, the United States has proven to be an unfortunate surprise in many ways, because it's become now the largest the epicenter of the virus in the world. Now, the US is a big consumer and also determines the sentiment of consumption globally. So how does that change, and how does it affect an economy like India in good times or in situations like this?
Well, I think it depends on where you are starting from. So our India starting point was we had 5% growth last year. The sentiment was down, both business and household. So and on top of that, you have further depression of sentiment. So I think it will hit you even more harder. Because of that. So both business and household sentiments, I think, are down. I think globally in India, and the more it prolongs, the more they will be depressed. And sentiment channel or confidence channel is very, very critical. Very, very critical for staging a swift recovery. So unless confidence and sentiments don't improve, and that will only improve once you start seeing things improving.
Right. So assuming, let's say, if we were to take a more positive scenario, or assume a positive scenario, let's say, we see a peak out in April to June quarter, maybe earlier, because one data point we're looking at, for instance, is the number of positive tests versus the number of tests the number of tests conducted. And currently it's under 3%. So if at this point, the impact seems to be low. Whether this will play out later as the next 25,000 samples are collected, we don't know. But let's say things improve faster than maybe what we expect. And of course, we've got a lockdown in progress. So that has its own impact. So now, if that is the case, can the Indian economy recover independently of, let's say, other economies, which may take longer, and could we break away in a manner of speaking, as opposed to, let's say, Europe or United States, which has now become the epicenter?
To some extent, that's a possibility, but I think but we are also more integrated now. I think if I take you back to global financial crisis, India grew at 3.9%, whereas the advanced countries actually suffered a recession, which is negative growth rate. World economy itself suffered. So India, I think in that sense, some growth will always be there. I mean, the point is, in India, maybe 4 and 5% GDP growth feels like a recession, because I think you're starting from a low base. The other thing which I forgot to mention, but I wanted to highlight about this what is happening currently, why it is so difficult is, in mathematics we use the term non-linearity, which is exponential. And exponential or non-linear behavior, I think it's extremely difficult for humans to assess that. I think it's known. I mean, you can't. I mean, if you take the example which is often given is, if you take 30 steps or 35 steps, and one step is second step is 2 times the first step, I think you would have made a trip to the moon. So that is the exponential. I mean, it's very, very hard to visualize. I think that is the key challenge most people are facing. And so the forecasts going wrong, I think in this environment, there's a huge margin around the number that you are projecting. And so you need to keep, as I said, you need to keep relooking at it. I mean, as more hard evidence becomes available.
Right, but you're saying conceptually it is possible that we may do better than the world or the rest of the world if we were to be more insulated from this pandemic.
But that assumption is a very bold assumption.
Yeah.
I think,
okay.
I think so. That's not a base case. In the base case, even if the other economies are getting hurt, I think whatever we export is not been doing well. That will shrink further. I mean, because the demand for your products, let's say gems and jewelry, clothing, or whatever you export is good. Iron ore, for instance, I mean, economic activity going down will shrink that. So clearly, I think you will get hit. But the point is, there's some. I think it's a domestic-driven economy. If it controls the pandemic, which is very hard to visualize right now. I mean, that will what base case I painted, right. You will be better than that. I think is a heroic assumption at this juncture. But if it does play out, yes, I think we'll be somewhat better. So just to give you an example, China's case. China's GDP in the January to March quarter, because of the pandemic, is expected to go down by minus 10% according to S&P, and I think others are also in the same range. But the annual growth is 2.9%, which means there is a sharp recovery ahead because they've already controlled it.
Right, and there is talk of factories resuming production in China.
Right. And same thing can play out here if you control it.
Yeah. So and sort of one quick China question. So India in relation to China, I mean, we import a lot of goods from them, or in electronics, almost all our mobile phones come from there. So how is this likely to play out? And is it a negative? Is it a positive?
No, we will actually we will have to keep importing because there's no replacement. I mean, for China, and I think we are also critically dependent on them for, let's say, pharmaceutical sector, which APIs, which I think they are resuming, and also automobile components. So there is, I think, so those things we will keep importing from them. But in general, the overall import levels will come down because income levels will suffer. So your ability to consume domestic and imported stuff is anyway going to go down. So that will also reflect in Chinese imports, and our exports to China, let's say cotton or iron ore, etc. They've also already started going down.
Right. Okay. So two quick questions on the announcements last night by the finance minister, and then, of course, the Reserve Bank governor today. So yesterday's announcements talked about food and security, in a manner of speaking. So how do you assess that? Is that enough for what it was supposed to be?
Well, I think it's the first step. I think depending on how it plays out, I think you might have to top that up going ahead. So this is the first step, and I think, and rightly aimed at the most vulnerable parts, both cash and kind. I think India's good fortune this year is that we have good food grain stocks, and agriculture Rabi's production is expected to do reasonably well. So you have stuff to distribute. Otherwise, I think that could have been another challenge. So that is right, and I think. So fiscal stimulus cannot stop at that. I think there are many other elements that need support. I think particularly there are vulnerable, as I said earlier, vulnerable companies, etc., whose businesses will get disrupted. So they will need some sort of a loan to tide over the situation, which they can pay back when the things resume, when we are back to normal. But if you don't provide that, then they may just disappear.
Right. Okay. So let me not ask you the Reserve Bank question because it's too current. But let me ask you something a little different. If you were to now be talking to a young group of economic students, how would you say or define this phase, and how would you ask them to prepare for a similar phase in their own careers?
Well, I think anyway, the profession of economics is undergoing a change. I mean, because of big data, etc. I think you have more information available. I think there is as one of the data scientists had said, you have wealth of information but poverty of attention. So that is what is in general playing out. And I think in the pandemic situation, I think the big data or fast that becomes really useful. I mean, not only for managing the health situation, which China has been doing, but also for managing the economic situation. So clearly, I think so you'll have to rely be more nimble in your approach. And the economics is not something that you learn in your school and then you can keep applying it for like 25 years, which most of us have done. I think you need to change according to time, and my I think prescription would be that you should be very flexible. I mean, in your approach and use the high frequency, short term, big data. I think you need to learn how to use them effectively in your analysis, and that is what is going to help at this time, because in a disruptive situation, the relationship between variables completely get distorted. So you have to form judgments on the basis of incoming information. You use theory, but you still use that.
Right.
So, for instance, right now, I mean, just to quote Larry Summers, who's a Harvard professor and I think was pretty well known. Yeah, he said that, I mean, if somebody says that they know the quantification of the impact, I think they're not telling the truth. I think you know the direction, you don't know the quantification. So I think it's keep your options open, and I think and eyes and ears open to all sorts of information coming in, assimilate it, and then I think form an opinion. You cannot do it on the basis of textbook information.
Right. And that's a good note to end on. D.K. Joshi, Chief Economist of CRISIL, thank you so much for speaking with us and taking us through the Economics 101 of a pandemic. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.